Good evening. So I'm Kyle, and my presentation today is going to be on rent stabilization in New York City. So we're going to first discuss the differences between rent control and rent stabilization in New York, because these are actually two separate programs. They're related, but they're different. Next, we're going to just breeze through the history of rent control and rent stabilization, and then we're going to look at the effects and views on rent stabilization specifically, because rent control is kind of small. And lastly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the future and do a little bit of speculation. It's going to be a little bit of my own opinion. So let's begin. So, rent stabilization and rent control are about limiting the amount of rent a landlord can charge. And this is for many different reasons. I'll talk about the goals a little later, but that's their mechanism is landlords can only charge this much. And so how do they determine that? With rent control, it's through the maximum base rent system, not something I'm going to be talking about today. It's a little bit out of scope. But for rent stabilization, that is done through the Rents Guidelines Board. And this board is appointed by the mayor. And so when you hear about Mamdani saying he's going to freeze the rents, this is what he's referring to. It's this Rent Guidelines Board. So you can see um, when you freeze the rent, you put it at 0%. And it's actually been done before. Um, so let's say I have a 1 year lease on an apartment that is $2,000 a year. So I'm getting my lease renewed today. My landlord's gonna look at this 1 year renewal lease, 3% growth. So that would mean that he can charge an additional $60 from next year's rent. So 2,600, $2,060 will be my new rent for next year. Um, Generally, with rent stabilization, the landlord has to offer the tenants a renewal lease, and it has to be 1 or 2 years long. That's the lease term. And then generally, rent stabilization buildings are going to be built before 1971, buildings with six or more units. And oftentimes, it's not done by the building, it's actually done by the unit. So a landlord might have, 5 apartment buildings, and one of these apartment buildings might be 20 rent stabilized units and 20 market units that are not subject to rent stabilization. And generally, while rent control is kind of fixed, the number of apartments, and it's just been slowly decreasing, rent stabilization, more apartments can be added. Sometimes it's through rent control, but given the small number of rent control apartments that are out now, usually when apartments are added through rent stabilization, it's because a certain tax credit has kind of run out. And so these tax credit apartments are now rent stabilized apartments. And so there's about 1 million rent stabilized units. Um, that's about the same as the number of market rate units. I think market rate might be a little less than 1 million. Rent control, pretty minimal, 16,000 to 24,000 is the estimates I've seen. So let's just go through the history now. And first rent controls were enacted during World War One, and a common theme is low vacancy rates. Um, Rents were going up. Tenants were like, we need rent control. And so that's why rent control came to New York City. But in the 1920s, they were a lot more successful in building new units. So vacancy rates actually went up to 8%. And you can see why. They had exemptions for new units for the rent control, and new units were not charged property tax. So they actually repealed this version of rent control in 1929. And then World War II comes around, and the amount of money that the federal government is like putting into the wartime industries combined with, construction shortages because they're putting all the material towards the war effort. No new construction. Um, Also, not a lot of construction during the Great Depression. Massive spike in rents. So in 1942, the federal government establishes the Office of Price Administration, and then OPA institutes rent control the next year because of threats of a rent strike and also the Harlem riots. They were afraid of more civil disturbance. So then New York State actually kind of picks up the tab on rent control administration in 1951. And then the quote unquote end of rent control comes during from the 50s onwards. Rent control becomes progressively weaker. Um, Landlords are able to charge more on rent. So and they also have more deregulation of luxury apartments, although that's kind of minimal. Only about 12,000 units became deregulated through that. And in 1971, the state of New York decided to restrict any new laws that are about rent control. That's the Erstat restrictions. And rent control units that were vacated after June 30th, 1971, were decontrolled. So they became market rate units. But nonetheless, there was still the housing affordability issues. Um, Partially because this was the era of some slum clearance, and a lot of those affordable units were just being demolished for highways and for less affordable units that would be for the middle class. Yeah, you can read up on the Power Broker. It kind of discusses this um, as part of the issue. So in 1969, the rent stabilization was passed, and this also establishes the Rent Guideline Board. And then in 1974, the 1971 units that were decontrolled, that were formerly rent controlled and then decontrolled, are actually re-stabilized under the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. And then we'll jump ahead a little bit. Rent stabilization was kind of weakened throughout the 90s and aughts. A lot of the high rent units were deregulated upon vacancy, and this leads to about 150,000 units being deregulated. And so, because of all this deregulation and also some other like loopholes, like landlords could like come in and be like, I am using this for personal use. So this unit is no longer going to be rent stabilized. So in 2019, the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act is passed, and this ended vacancy decontrol, which means no longer um, if a tenant leaves, you can't just deregulate the apartment. High rent, income decontrol also is removed, and vacancy bonus is also removed. And the vacancy bonus was if a tenant left a unit, then the landlord could raise rent more than what the rent guideline boards would have been if, say, the tenant had stayed. And this kind of incentivized landlords to want to like have these rent stabilized unit households leave their rent stabilized units so that they could have more they can raise the rent more for the next tenant. But that's been removed in 2019. And so just a brief summary of what's the differences. And now let's just talk about briefly what are some of the goals of rent stabilization? Because it's one of these policies that like it could have so many different goals, but to understand and to be able to judge its effectiveness, we should really like think about, why it's being established. So, you know, it could be to preserve affordable housing, save renters money, promoting socioeconomic and racial equity. Could be all these things. Could also just be a cynical ploy to win renters votes. Imagine a lot of conservative outlets think that way. Um, or even like you want to take a really critical stance, could be really to ensure landlords have steady earnings because if the market was deregulated, all of a sudden you could face something like Austin or like I don't know, COVID, where all of a sudden like your ability to charge rent has gone down because of the market. So rent stabilization is like you won't get as much now, but it will always be coming in steadily. The rent will always increase, even if not increasing at the rate of the market right now. So these units will always have like a stable source of income, even if it's not that much. So economists really do not like rent control, and we have a very handy graph to show you here. It's the supply and demand curves. And you can see that without rent control, you get a higher price, but you get more units. And this allegedly is what makes society happiest. But we look at this, all of a sudden the price is lower. And this is good for some tenants who are able to stick in their apartments, but the quantity is lower. And the quantity being lower, we can understand that as, you know, some of these landlords, they can convert the apartments that are rentals into condos, or they can say, I'm just not going to maintain these apartments. I am going to let them sit empty. They are not worth the money and investment to have another renter in there. And then another common complaint is that benefits from rent control are not distributed equitably. So what I mean by that is a high income renter and a low income renter are both benefiting about the same amount from rent control. And in fact, actually, especially with something like rent stabilization, where there isn't really a central directory of rent stabilized units in New York, although there are some websites that kind of have like incomplete um, listings of rent controlled apartments. Oftentimes, you're at an informational disadvantage if you are like lower income or lower education. So that's another issue is, wealthy renters who might be college educated are more able to like access rent controlled units or rent stabilized units, I should say, over the people who might actually need it more, which would be working class, non-college educated households or like immigrant households who, might not speak English or are not familiar with New York City. But tenant advocates would say, maybe these are all true. Um, but what rent control does is it preserves a supply of affordable housing. It's going to keep tenants in place, and this allows these tenants to build community. Like you hear about tenants who are able to stay in their apartments for 20, 30, 40 years, which in a non-rent controlled city is like almost unthinkable. So this promotes neighborhood stability and it promotes like connections with between neighbors. And it also like will protect people who are renting from like shocks like inflation or like, wages not growing, but gentrification is coming along. So it just protects people who are most affected by rent increases. So these are all just hypothesized effects. Let's see what the research says. So the National Multi-Family Housing Council is kind of an interest group for um, essentially, if you want to be a little cynical, landlords who operate large housing units and complexes. But to their credit, I think this review is it's not weighted super heavily to like favor, all of the landlord's arguments because it does say that, it's not effective at targeting benefits and it doesn't lead to more socioeconomically integrated neighborhoods. And what that means is basically poor people and wealthy people, yeah, wealthy people are still benefiting just as much, maybe sometimes even more from um, rent control and rent stabilization. And keep in mind, this is all national, um, but it does lead to tenants staying in a place longer. And it actually does not lead to lower quality housing, especially when you combine it with certain regulations. And it doesn't lead to less housing construction, but it will lead to higher market rate prices. And so this is actually something that is this one is actually a little less obvious and is a little bit more controversial from the literature. Um, Dornsife at the University of Southern California also did a review, I should say, and this was done at the same time, both 2018. And it also kind of comes to similar conclusions. Um, it does say, however, that rent control does not lead to higher market prices based on some studies done in the 90s in New Jersey and California. Um, this could be because, there's more construction's really not affected. So new construction actually might be incentivized because it's not covered by rent stabilization schemes. Um, it also could be because rent controlled units are not as well maintained. And with the hedonistic model, um, people living near them will want to pay less for those units because they see this building that might not be super well maintained or might be, you know. might have people that they don't like as much, so they're just going to pay less for these units. Or it could just be the landlord seeing the rent controlled units are like, we need to lower our prices to compete so that, tenants aren't scared away and aren't just going to wait for another rent stabilized unit to open up. So that's some of their conclusions. And then for some more like research, original research, Glazer and Lutmer did a paper in 2003 looking at misallocation of apartments, and they concluded very significant in New York City compared to a non-rent stabilized city. Um, you can see that like they say about adjusting for some like statistical anomalies and biases, about 21% of units in New York City are allocated differently than how they would be allocated in a city that doesn't have rent control. And so this could mean that like people are consuming more apartment, which means they are having larger apartments than they really should be. Well, there's other people who are having smaller apartments than they really should be. And then a different angle is looking at, what are renters gaining? And that's what Zapatka and De Castro Galvo, apologies for butchering that, looked at. And they argued that Hispanic and foreign-born householders are more likely to live in rent-stabilized units. And there is significant evidence for both rent savings and rent burden reduction. And here we have like the descriptive statistics. I'm not going to pause here and read over them. You can see that rent controlled units generally cheaper. And here's a logistic regression table. If you're afraid of advanced planning methods, I can explain. You see a Hispanic here. Um, Above one means that they're more likely to be in a stabilized unit. So you can see Black and Hispanic much more likely, both in the 90s sample and the 2000 sample. Also, college graduate, foreign born more likely as well. And um, if it's below one, it's less likely. So basically, the more money you make, the less likely you are to live in a rent stabilized unit. And this was true in the 90s, and it's true in the 2000s. Go keep going. You can see that so in the 90s, I think it's a little less clear. It depends on how you model it. But in the 2000s, there is a huge, strong evidence that you would have saved a lot of money living in a rent stabilized unit versus a market rate unit. And you can see that rent stabilization was actually pretty effective in reducing rent burden tenants. Of course, 51% is still 51% too many rent burden tenants, but it's better than 63%. So let us continue. So the future of rent control, rent stabilization, not going anywhere. Um, Mamdani just won the election. And he's not going to replace the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act because that would be against basically everything he stands for. And so when he says freeze the rent, like I said, it's going back to the rent guidelines board. He's gonna get people. He's gonna. I think it's a board of 9 people. He's gonna select his members, and he's gonna try to get these members to vote to keep to essentially say put a 0%, a big fat zero for the 1 year and the probably the 2 year as well renewal lease. So that's basically what it means when he says freeze the rent. And it has happened before, during COVID, happened in 2016, 2017 under Bill de Blasio. And to some extent, it also does already exist for elderly, disabled veterans, but they have to opt in for freezing the rent. And it comes in the form of a tax credit rather than a actual reduction in the rent that they're paying. So there are some political considerations for why rent control is not going away. The first is it's just so popular with tenants, and New York City is just such a big tenant city. And the second part is like rent control is, rent stabilization is actually like kind of the carrot on the stick of housing construction. So this is an interesting graph I saw from, the history of New York City rent control. So you can see that when rent control was enacted, there was a massive a spike in new construction for housing. And then you can see that after World War II ended, there was also another spike. And you can see like throughout the mid mid 40s to 60s before the zoning laws were enacted, there's considerable new dwelling unit construction, although this was also the era of urban renewal, so I don't think there was much net gain because of that. But you can see that like historically, there's no real evidence that rent control and rent stabilization is hindering construction of units, which makes sense because it's not targeting new units. The um the more interesting thing is in order to like get people on board with building more housing units, rent stabilization might actually be a part of that. And so I found this is an article about Berlin, but essentially the authors came in with a hypothesis that rent stabilization, because it makes people stay in their neighborhoods longer, it might make them more NIMBY. But in reality, it actually makes them more yes to new housing construction. And they hypothesize it's because, you know, housing construction, it's long, it's complicated, and oftentimes it's coming when a neighborhood is on the upswing and when rents are going up. So a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, see the new construction as the reason for their housing prices and their rental prices going up. So in order to convince people that, hey, we should be building housing, oftentimes you have to protect their existing, way of life, their existing rental, and that is going to be through rent stabilization. So maybe by freezing the rent, Mamdani will be able to like, if he wants to take this path, he'll be able to be like, hey, now that we froze the rent, we can get people to build more housing. We can have developers build more housing, and the private market will actually the supply will actually increase. And this historically has happened. You can even see like this is the Bill de Blasio era. There's more units being finished than ever before. So hopefully this all works out, especially with like the whole city of yes thing coming in, which I don't know. I don't know if that's going to come in the way like uh, zoning advocates and maybe anti-zoning advocates would want. But hey, rent stabilization might be a tool that like helps people, you know, be more supportive of new housing development. And that would be great for New York City. And so thank you so much. And yeah, please leave your questions. I've like tried to record this a lot of times and I always go over, and it's just I have so much to say and I feel like I just can't explain everything. So thank you so much. And yep, stay up and stay stabilizing your rent. Thank you so much. All right.